Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about 2 minutes. Well, actually a little over a minute. Just waiting for everybody to sign in at the top of the hour. Hopefully folks aren't getting ice out of the storm that's coming down. It's just rain or snow. While you're waiting, you might as well go ahead and open up your chat pod. That's where we'll put the link to the handouts and stuff. And you might want to go ahead and open up your Q&A pod. That's where we'll put questions in from us. And then, of course, either go to Poll EV or download the app, because we'll definitely be taking advantage of that tool. Okay, we'll give folks about 30 more seconds to sign in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And if you open up your chat pod here, we'll be reposting in just a second the handout and links to all the things you need to have links to. So, okay, so good morning and welcome to another one of our foundational webinars. After a short hiatus, last week we were up in Saratoga Springs at the County Highway Superintendents Association Winter Conference. Weather was a little colder up there than it is today. They're calling for some possible ice, so hopefully nobody gets that. We don't mind snow and rain, but ice, nah, nobody likes that. But today we're going to be talking about road and street issues. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads program. And hopefully everybody is ready to go. Okay, so we got about 50 of us on today. That'll be pretty cool. Now, again, if you open up your chat pod, you'll be able to get some information. This is the last of our webinars are listed here for the rest of this season. So we'll be doing webinars every Tuesday until March 12th. And then we'll be doing our in-person workshops for the year. We'll starting those up. And we'll see you again over the summer with our webinars. You'll notice the ones that have an asterisk beside them, those are worth 1 professional development hour. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In terms of our workshops, you'll notice we're going all over the state, both in the spring, take the summer off, and then back in the fall. And you'll see at the top of the list, there's a little green there. It says rights and responsibilities. We're rebuilding our powers and duties class, which talks a lot about legal issues. And you may want to go ahead and sign up for that one in particular. But obviously, you can see we're all over the state with lots of different workshops. We hope to see you there. If you haven't been on one of these webinars before, please remember that the lower left is your audio settings. Open up the chat pod. That's where we'll put in links to the materials and or things that we want to have out as a message. We may ask you to raise your hands. I'll do that at least once or twice during the session. And then if you have a question, you'll be able to put it in the Q&A. Okay. Now, again, this is worth 1 PDH for engineers here in New York State. Just because of the way the rules work, we're going to make sure it's audit proof. You got to be on for most of the session, and only the person who is registered can get in there. And then course-wise, this is a course, not a continuing education activity. Okay. Now, if you're from another state, and we'll talk about that in a second, you'll need to check with your LTAP center to see if it meets the rules in terms of requirements and stuff like that. Now, before we get started, a bit of a caveat. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV, so everything I'm talking about is from my perspective as an engineer and being the director, and before that, working in a county a few decades ago, like it or not. Okay. Now, 2 things. Notice that in the Q&A, we'll put a link to the poll. The poll is Poll Everywhere. We'll have that here in just a second. And if you can't access the handout, there's a handout that goes with this, which has a bunch of cool references that you might want to have. We can email it to you. So don't worry about that. We can just send you an email with the direct link, because we know some people just can't get to our storage up on the box. We'll take care of that. So let's do a bit of a welcome. And again, we're going to start with a poll. To do this, pollev.com/DavidOrPE. It's just easy to remember. And again, if you don't want to type that in, there is a link over in the chat. Though if you haven't opened it yet, we'll repost that for you. Okay. Now, Before we do the welcome, I just want to remind you of where we're getting all these materials. And again, there's links in the handout. One of them comes from our workbook called Powers and Duties. It's a workshop we've taught for decades. We're rebuilding that class right now. We actually have a preview session coming up in February. And as you saw on the map, we'll be launching it around the state later this spring. And the new name will be Rights and Responsibilities, to make sure you realize there's a lot of new materials and it's going to be very different as we move forward. We have a Reducing Liability for Highway and Public Works Departments. That course was only launched a year and a half ago, so it's a brand new course as well. So we're redoing both of our main legal courses, so you may want to get materials out of that. And then there's still some stuff on running your highway department. There's a lot of overlap. That's more of a general class, and yes, we're teaching that in the spring as well. Okay, so let's find out where you're from. So who do you work for? And if you can't access the polls, feel free to put it into the Q&A. We can, adjust. This helps me as much as it helps everybody else figuring out who's here. So for instance, we have 6 from the state or federal. We have 4 tribal, no tribal. We have 7 cities or villages, 5 county, 4 town. Wow, nice variety. I like it. It's pretty cool. Okay. And we have 1 honest person who says they work for the weekend. Well, you got a few days to work on. So what do? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway superintendent or DPW commissioner? Are you an engineer by trade, field crew, supervisor, elected board member, or none of the above? Do me a favor. If you are none of the above, type into the Q&A pod, what is your role? What is it that you actually do? Okay. And again, if you can't get into the poll, which is pollev.com/DavidOrPE, just type the letter in and I'll adjust. It's okay. Okay. Okay, so we have someone with the Tug Hill Commission. We got another person who is a highway superintendent. Okay, and a lot of engineers. Yeah, that makes sense. And a general foreman. Okay, which we would have probably thrown in as field crew / board member, but we'll make it. We have a retired PE. Cool. Okay. So how long have you been on the job? I want your current position, not how long you've been in working, just how long you've been in your current position. Because things change as you change positions. So let's see what we have. We have a few of you with 20 plus. We got some less than a month folks. Maybe they've elected brand new, starting in January 1st. That's cool. Like to see that. And again, a nice variety of range. I was looking yesterday at the longevity of county highway officials, the superintendents and DPW commissioners. The average is pretty good, 8 years, but the median is less than 5, which means that over half of the county highway officials have been on the job for 5 or less years. So we need to make sure we talk with each other, create networking, because it really helps, especially if you're new. And if you're one of the brand new people, welcome aboard. Now, where are you from? You can click right on this one. It's pretty cool. You can actually click on this. And by the way, the chat is disabled. It's Q&A where you'll be putting in your inputs, just if you're wondering. But where you're from, you can click right on the map. And if you can't access it, you can just type it into the Q&A. I can read it off of the Q&A and we can figure it out. Okay, we've got a good variety. I like this. We have a lot of folks along the thruway, a bunch downstate, a couple up towards Watertown. Okay. The good thing is with legal issues, not a huge difference. The law is pretty much the same all over the place, so we'll figure that out. Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the law. And one of the things I like to think about is where law comes from. And if you've ever read Oliver Twist, or more likely you've seen the musical, there's a scene early on where they find a bunch of trinkets that have been disposed of illegally by the wife of the guy who runs the orphanage. And when he's asked about the fact that it's his responsibility to make sure if nothing happened, because his wife supposedly works in his direction, he says the law is, well, an idiot. He uses another word in the book and the movie. But the point is there is issues with the law sometimes. The law has a basis. So let's start looking at something that everybody's commonly typing into. So let's have a little bit of fun. Traffic control devices, signs, stripe signals. There's a brand new set of rules that just got posted and goes into effect in about another 30 days or so. In fact, we'll be posting some information about that. But what is the basis of all these traffic control devices? Why are none of the 3 that you see there really proper? Well, they don't meet the requirements that have been put in place, or they actually can create problems and make it less safe. And good signs help, bad signs can hurt. Where does it come from? Well, there's a basis of all of this. Like it or not, we don't think about it very often. You're thinking traffic signs and the Constitution. Well, yeah, it actually comes from the Constitution. And then the Constitution, there are laws written. Those laws can be written at the federal or state level. Then those are used to write regulations. Within those regulations, there'll be usually policy documents that come in, or there might be a guide of some type. And then finally, if there's a work that's being done, there may actually be an agreement or a contract that goes into place. So let's just look at traffic signs and think about that relationship. So we have the Constitution, we the people, and all that in the preamble. And of course, all of you are now humming that song in the back of your head. And there are laws. So for instance, in New York State, if you want to look at highway law, you can actually go back into the 1700s for laws that talk about notification and guideposts and other things to help people traveling along. They didn't call them so much highways, but paths and routes and things like that. And they're old military roads that go back into the 1700s. Now, of course, we've done a lot more since then, and this is the national manual, the old national manual. It's still in effect for, as I say, another 30 days or so, but it's a set of regulations. But like a lot of things, you can have a local law, you can have a state law, and they can change other regulations and laws. So for instance, here in New York State, we have a supplement to the national MUTCD, as it's called, and those are very important because you have to follow those within New York State, but they have to be approved at the federal level, okay? Now, this leads to people having different policies that they might have. So for instance, children at play signs, a lot of agencies have a local policy, we don't put them up. Some do. And again, you need to think about what policies you're going to have in place in your community and your agency, or if you're an engineer, when you're doing work for others. Now, there are guides that are out there. Those guides actually might be something you need to think about, or they might just be useful. For instance, we produced a traffic sign handbook here, and yes, we'll be updating that. That's based on a document that was originally produced by the State Department of Transportation. We picked it up around 2000. And it actually follows all of the policies and regulations, and you could use it in the field, but the whole basis, you really have to go back to the regulation of the law to really get a sense of what's got to be done. And then, of course, there may be an agreement or a contract that you have to think about. So, for instance, a highway superintendent and the town board are supposed to have an agreement on how to spend monies, including what signs to put up and things like that. So think about this as you're thinking about legal issues. Again, sometimes it's good to think about where all of this comes from. And there may be some pretty important court cases this year at the Supreme Court level dealing with some of these regulation and policy issues. It'll be an interesting year to watch for sure. So let me just ask you from this standpoint, what are the responsibilities of a highway department or a public works department? And do this as one word. We're going to create a little wordle. And you're going to go, but we're talking about legal issues, but think about what are the responsibilities of a highway or public works department. So put in one word, let's see what you have. And again, if you can't access this, go ahead and feel free to put it into the Q&A, and I can just modify that and talk about it. So safety is coming up. Safety has shown up in the Q&A. Access, being able to get onto the roadway and off. Yeah, okay. We got to worry about commerce. We got to worry about the municipal infrastructure. Yep. Construction, maintenance. Yep. Okay. All of these are pretty cool. Good ideas. Movement. Okay. And so far, most of your answers tend to be sort of the 10,000 foot level, high level responsibilities. And yes, we got to start there. So maybe we're down at the constitutional level almost. But what's the general thing you think about responsibilities? But there's going to be even more specific things you have to think about. And again, what's the legal basis and what are the legal requirements that you have to follow through? Now, if you're with a town here in New York State, the good news for you in a town is there's something called the Red Book. It's officially called the Office of the Town Highway Superintendent. It's put out by the Association of Towns, published every 5 or 10 years or so. And the most current version has got a 2017 date on it. And if you are a town highway superintendent, you absolutely want to have this in your library. If you're a county highway superintendent, you absolutely want this in the library because a lot of county roads started as town roads and some of the rules still follow. And there's some good guidance in any case for budgeting and setting things up. And so even if you're with a village or with a city, you might actually want to be able to look through this document. There is a document on officials at the village level put out by NYCOM. It's not as specific to public works, but there's some good information in there, especially from a legal standpoint, you may want to look at. So again, start building up your library. So I'm going to ask you, okay, first off, I'm going to lower everybody's hands. Raise your hand if in your office you have a copy of highway case law from McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York. Raise your hand. Okay. So out of about 60 of you that have now joined us, we've only got about 10 of you up to that have a copy in your office. Okay. So now we know that some of you have access. Raise your hand if you know where you could go get yourself a copy of McKinney's to look at the case law. Let's see. Everybody should have a copy of the case law because as we're going to talk, we talked about that lovely series of steps that sounds great on paper from the Constitution up to agreements. The reality is, if a law is written and there's a concern, well, then it's going to go to court. And the courts may make a decision that may actually affect the law. So you really want access to case law. It's absolutely vital that you know where you can get your hands on case law. And there's literally over 100 books that you have to have. You might have the Highway series, which is currently 3 books, but there's plenty of others that you may want to be able to have access to. County law, town law, village law, general municipal law, things like that. Where can you get a copy? Your county clerk's office. Every county clerk will have a copy of the case law, and we'll talk about a couple of very critical ones where you really want to have access to the case law. So keep that in mind and make sure you know where a copy is. And again, a lot of county highway departments do have copies as well. So you might be able to get one by wandering over to the county highway department. Okay, so let's look at a mailbox. A mailbox. Now that sits on the side of the road. It's allowed to be there. There's some rules about that. But again, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many of you have a policy, if you work for a public works department or a highway department, on what mailboxes are put up along your roadway? How many of you have a policy? A couple of you. Remember, we already talked about the fact that almost all of you sort of put down in that wordle that safety was your #1 thing. So if we put an object right next to the roadway that could be dangerous, how are we balancing that? There's a right for it to be there, but there are requirements for it to be there in a safe manner. So that having a policy is something you may want to think about. There are policies from the U.S. Postal Service on requirements for the postal system, but yeah, you may want some breakable post to make sure that it's safe, that it doesn't become a fixed object. So think about all of these legal issues that you got to deal with. Okay, so you should have a policy, surprisingly, on mailboxes. So let's break out the big kahuna here. Let's talk about right-of-way. So you get to click on the picture in this case. And again, you can comment on it in the Q&A if you can't access the picture. What's the edge of the right-of-way here? Put a little dot where the edge of the right-of-way is here. And I'll explain something in just a second. Okay. Probably a little more than the middle of the road. Okay. So most of you are putting your little dot right at the fence line. Okay. And I'm not going to say that I disagree with you. That's probably pretty good. But what's going to really matter with the right-of-way is what kind of right-of-way is it? And some of you are marking the edge of the asphalt. That might be true as well. Okay. Some of you have marked the front of the tree. There are 2 major types of roadways in terms of right-of-ways here in New York State. There's roads that are owned by an agency or they have an easement, and those that are by use or by prescription. Okay, so here, for instance, is a road by use. This is under town highway law. And under town highway law, and yes, it does affect county roads if they started as a town road, The right-of-way could be in a deed, or it could be an easement, or it could be by use. If it's a deed, the deed will say it goes out X number of feet, or we love to use rods because we love modern units. It could be 2 rods, 3 rods, and that would be measured off of some old meets and bounds survey. You could have an easement. Well, you don't own the road. You have an easement for the road through a particular stretch of property, or to allow you to make a bridge a little bit wider or something like that. If you have that, great. But the other choice is by use. And by use is what has been used and maintained by the agency for a period of 10 or more years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The deeds are to be filed at the county clerk's office. That really is a good repository. In fact, even in the few cases where there's actually the ability to post something at the town clerk's office, we recommend go ahead and post a version of it at the county clerk's inside the deed for that particular property. This will be easy to find. It's always a challenge because you can go down to the county clerk's office to look at the deeds, but it could be a quitclaim deed. They're just sometimes a different office. It could be something that's filed like in subdivision law at the town clerk's office. It could be something at the village clerk's office in a village. You can always tie it back to a property. Try to do that. Try to have it tied back. And if you're doing federal aid, by the way, you have to have something in writing. So you can't just use a by use situation. You absolutely want to tie it to the property in that particular case. You could have an easement, okay? Now, for long term, you need a permanent easement, and that goes through the legal process, and you're going to bring your municipal attorney involved and all that fun stuff. But you may need a temporary easement, okay? Temporary easements, when I started, they were done with a handshake. These days, really need to put them in writing, but they don't have to be complicated. We can make them overcomplicated. It's an agreement where you do a handshake back and forth, and you're doing it in writing just to say, so everybody's explicit, hey, what are we doing? In this case, it's one that we put together just to illustrate we're going to be dumping ditch material in a pile. So we clean the ditch, we put it in the person's front yard in a pile. We're not spreading it out, we're not seeding it, we're not doing anything but dumping it in a pile from the back of the truck. So everybody's on board. Okay, so we can't later on go, well, you promised you were going to level it off and grade it and plant wildflower seeds that when they grow up, they look like the letter Q. No, try to put it in writing, but a temporary thing. Here's the rule of thumb for temporary versus permanent. If you are going to be back, it is permanent. If it is something that the homeowner is going to maintain into the future and there's no plans to be back, that's temporary. So cutting down a tree, good example of temporary. Parking equipment overnight off the property of the roadway, temporary. Cleaning out a ditch, opening the end of a culvert, permanent. You're going to be back to maintain that. You really want to think about a permanent easement in that particular case. Now, there's a great Q&A sitting there, and we're going to be talking about by use in here. So the phrase by use would apply to private roads that have been used for more than 50 years. Well, probably not, but maybe. The by use rules, and it's actually a by use section in town law, town highway law, there is a streets by prescription under village law. They have the exact same wording with a couple of words. I mean, literally we're talking 1 or 2 word differences, but the courts are slightly different in how they're defining a street by prescription and a road by use. But here's the rule of thumb. It's actually used and maintained by the agency, and it's actually a public use, okay? So if it's a private road that's never been maintained by a municipal agency, then it's not likely to be a public road. It might be a private road, but it's not going to be a public road that's maintained by a public entity. There are some slight differences inside of a village because villages have the ability to zone things. And if you're inside of a village boundary, my recommendation is make sure you designate the private roads as private, or there is a very slim chance they could move over. And by the way, if you're wondering why I keep hedging on all this, remember I said case law, you need to know where it is? McKinney's case law for the town highway side is 23 pages of summaries of the court cases involved with a 1-paragraph law on roads by use. Okay, there's another 13 pages, at least the last time I counted it, in streets by prescription. These are summaries. So there's lots of court cases. There have been some pretty major changes. I really would advise you to open up our Powers and Duties book. There's a really good chapter written by Jim Gellermini, who's the instructor we've had for that class. Excellent material on defining the by use situation. Okay. Now, someone asked a question about access to your property. Again, it may not be a public road maintained by the public, but it may be a private road that you still have rights of access. And that falls under real estate law and some other issues. But if in terms of maintained by a town, county, village, or city, it would really fall under the by use. And of course, if you're in the city, it's probably controlled by the charter as well. Now, one thing you do not do, people go, well, tax maps tell me the right of way, or there's the 3-rod rule because it actually shows up in the law. It actually says 3 rods. Now, don't use either of them to define the right of way. Okay, those are done for tax purposes. They're done to define, how we're going to charge things back. But the actual width is not controlled by the tax map. The tax maps are good to find who owns the property, but don't use those to define the width of the right of way. And even in some cases, whether it's a publicly maintained road or not. Okay. And if you're wondering, by the way, it's 10 years to gain a roadway. So you gain that right of way, and maybe even go wider. It only takes 6 years to lose it. Okay. And in terms of what counts one way or the other, well, trees are probably the most critical thing. Okay. If trees grow up along the side of the roadway, you may lose that right of way. It may actually be the front of those trees. Okay. Versus most people would have thought it was that fence line that's down there. Okay. Now, I will say there are some situations where the trees don't change the right of way because it's still considered part of the prism of the roadway. Yeah, court cases can get fun in this particular case. It comes down to, again, was it being used? Was it being maintained? Was there legitimate need for that slope as part of the roadway? And who put it in? I mean, it can get fairly complicated, and every case is unique. So just be aware of that fact that things can change with roads by use and streets by prescription. And if you think about it from a safety standpoint, then it should help figure out what you're going to do. And town boards do have the capability, instead of village boards, to set policies in place at the local level or even a local law that requires homeowners to keep things clear around intersections, not let trees grow up. That's called a right to control, and that's got to be done into the future. It's hard to go backwards. You'd have to pay for things if you want to remove something that's not in the right of way. And again, each case is going to be unique. If you're not sure, go back to the pyramid and think about, where does this fit? What the law says, there's a lot of court cases on top of that you're going to have to look at. There's certainly going to be lots of information about local laws, local regulations, and again, setting policies and being consistent can really help. Okay. Now, in terms of if you're managing a roadway, you've got powers and you've got duties. And of course, we have our friend Spider-Man, because the old thing his uncle told him before he was tragically killed in the good old comic strip, with great power comes great responsibility. So whether you want to call it powers and duties, or as we're calling it with the new workshop, rights and responsibilities, think about the specific things that you'd have to do. Okay. So now here's the wordle that we had here. Fairly general, safety, maintenance, things like that. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to clear the response. And I'm going to clear this. Now I want you to think about responsibilities, but I want you to be really specific. Think about little things that an agency does. Okay, think about rights and responsibilities. Yeah, striping on a roadway, filling potholes. Okay, yep. Let's come up with very specific things that you think about. Paving, putting up signs, possibly picking up litter. Yep. Taking care of snow and ice, dealing with obstacles. Dealing with ramps if you've got them, curbs, possibly dealing with public works. I see street lighting somebody put in on the Q&A. Yep. And whether you're doing a 10,000-foot elevation as we did earlier, or you're looking very specifically at things like catch basin repair that I see over in the Q&A, or you're dealing with ADA issues and crosswalks, washing of bridges, dealing with emergencies, those specifics and those generalities all still fall under the law. They all have a basis to them. So if you're not sure about something, go back and think about what is it that's giving you the right and the responsibility to do something, and be careful that you don't do something you don't have the right or the responsibility to take care of. Because, for instance, if you start maintaining something, it may become yours, and you may pick up the liability to keep maintaining it into the future if something goes wrong. A good example of that is that road by use issue. It sounds great. Hey, I can get more right of way. But then you have the responsibility to maintain that right of way in a reasonably safe way. Okay. So think about that at the upper level. Sometimes take a list. We recommend people do that on a regular basis and figure out what it is you've got to maintain. Okay. Now, what reports do you have to do on a regular basis? Okay. What are required reports? What do you have to do every single year if you work for a highway department or a public works department? What do you think are some required reports from a legal standpoint? Maybe a daily work report. Yeah, certainly help you later on. Financial stuff. We do that here, got to look at your stuff. Any inspections, especially of bridges, which is required, but you certainly should have that. Your highway inventory or CHIPS inventory, depending on how you do that, local road listing. Yep. And we're adding more and more accident reports. I see over in the Q&A, so operating costs possibly, or miles owned, money spent, MS4, storm sewer system reporting. If you're in an MS4 area, which is about 60% of the state now, it's growing. Okay, funding. Okay, certainly things to think about. A report to the board, and they may require additional stuff. You may have to do additional reports to the board. Okay. So I was looking for a few specific ones. If you are with a town or county, you actually have some requirements about machinery and inventory that you have to supply on a regular basis. If you're with a town, you have to have an agreement between you and the board, and we'll talk about that. It's called the 284. You as a department head have to certify payrolls and vouchers, okay? You have to provide record drawings. And again, these are required reports. Again, make yourself a list, try to keep track of it, maybe even set up a calendar to help you out on a daily basis like that. And let's talk about the most common one at the town level, especially. It's called the 284 agreement. It's an agreement between the board and the highway official on how to spend money. Now, the thing about a 284 agreement, I've talked to a lot of agencies who either don't fill them out or they're afraid if they fill them out, they're stuck. No. It's an agreement. It's not a contract. Okay, if you think about it, way at the top of the pyramid, it's probably above a contract. It's really an agreement. It just says explicitly what we're spending the money on. So general repairs could just be a simple number, and then later on you make a list of which roads you're going to chip seal. It's really looking at the permanent improvements to make sure everybody's on board. So when you say, hey, we were planning on paving 2 inches on Smith Street, everybody knows that ahead of time. But if something happens, if there's a crash and suddenly there's damage, or a culvert needs to be replaced because of a big flood, change the agreement. It can be changed every month. Heck, in a pinch, you could have an emergency meeting and change it every 2 weeks if you really wanted to at the town level. And even though it's not a requirement by law, we actually recommend all agencies have some kind of agreement between the highway department and the elected board. It's a communication tool as much as anything else. So let me just ask you, does your department have an agreement with the board? Yes, signed. Yes, submitted to the board only. Yes, informal. No, you're not sure. Okay. And again, if you're not able to, put it in the Q&A. Okay. And again, you probably should have something, even if you work for a village or a county or a city. It's a pretty good idea. Okay. And again, it's required by law for towns to have that agreement. And it just has to be filed and signed by 3 or more of the town board members. Okay. So again, if you're not sure, go see. It's worthwhile. And if you're with a consultant and you're talking with them, those board agreements can actually be very useful to know how they're planning on spending their money. Okay. And I see a B and A. Okay. So yes, even if it's only submitted to the board, communication more than anything else. Another major legal issue that comes up all the time, sometimes it's called FOIL, as in Freedom of Information Law. Someone did ask before I leave it, 284 agreement is not for cities, only for towns, but an agreement is still a good idea. Okay, it's not required except for town law. FOIL is the Freedom of Information Law, okay? Sometimes you'll see it FOIA because actually it's in the law itself, it's an act, so it's the Freedom of Information Act. Both are true. The idea behind a FOIL is a lot like a 284 agreement. It says that we need to be open and communicate. And there are rules about what you have to do and don't have to do in terms of FOIL. And we don't have anywhere close to the time to discuss that, but it comes up all the time. Easiest way to think about it is if the public asks for public information, you provide it to them in a reasonable basis. You should have a policy on how you fill that requirement. You don't have to provide information that is personal, okay? You don't have to provide certain information dealing with lawsuits or contract information. But again, think about what is publicly produced and should be publicly accessible. And again, you should have a policy for that. You should have a policy for dealing with emergencies. You know, who do you talk to? Do you know where you're going to pick up the phone and talk to somebody if you have a breakdown of one of your trucks? Who declares an emergency in a particular municipality? Do you meet on a regular basis? If this weather outside turns into a true ice storm, which again, I'm hoping it just stays in Pennsylvania if it ices at all. In fact, I'm hoping it doesn't ice even there. How do you deal with that emergency? Who takes the lead at a crash? These are legal issues. There's rights and responsibilities that highway departments have. Biggest thing though is have a good communication plan. Who takes care of things? Because a lot of this, frankly, comes down to risk. Okay, while there's powers and duties and rights and responsibilities, a lot of it comes back to liability and risk. I mentioned earlier, do you have a mailbox policy? Well, if you have a mailbox policy, I'm hoping this isn't allowed. This is a telephone pole buried in the ground that's holding the mailbox in the right-of-way. It's actually a deeded right-of-way. If somebody were to hit this, it'd be a pretty bad day for whoever hit it, and you wouldn't get your mail. But the point is you want to think about liability and risk. A lot of what we do is driven by that. So what are some ways to reduce liability? Give me some ideas of things you've done or you've seen done by others to reduce the liability for the agency you work for. And if you're with a consulting firm, are there things your consulting firm does to help reduce the liability? Okay. Follow the law, set up good policies. Yep. Maybe have a legal review of things. That's always a good idea. Document over in the Q&A. Yeah, document. Absolutely. Code enforcement. Doing a safety audit once in a while. If you set up a policy, one thing about a policy, once you set a policy, you need to make sure you follow that policy. So don't write a policy that's too restrictive. Good policies help. Bad policies can actually hurt you because they can force you to do things which don't always work. Having an inventory of your signs, your bridges, your culverts. Following standards and procedures, following having good standard operating procedures. If you don't have one, do you need one? I'm not saying you always need one. After 9/11, the FAA was asked, do we need to have a policy in place for dealing with something like what happened on 9/11? They agreed actually amongst themselves, no, better to give flexibility than to write a set of rules that become more important than why we wrote the rules in the first place. But yes, modify things. If you have standards, review them on a regular basis. So yeah, there's lots of ways to reduce liability. And again, y'all mentioned it earlier, it comes down to safety. Okay, so having a good, consistent, clear zone policy, for instance, is an excellent tool that you can have, right of way or not. If you've got safety related things, there's actually things you can do. Now, you may have to pay for the cost of removal of the tree and the landowner may get the wood, but if it's a safety related issue, you actually have a duty and a responsibility and a power to remove that unsafe tree. And if you cut a tree down, cut it flush. Anything above 4 inches could snag and cause a major crash. So having policies in place, again, comes back to safety. Now, in all of this, one of the things we worry about with liability is notice. Are we on notice? Can we be sued for something? Okay. There are two types of notice out there, written or actual. And yes, you'll see both terms used, and constructive. Okay. Written or actual notice essentially is when you are given something, usually filed at the clerk's office, surprisingly. If you weren't sure about that, it's actually the clerk's office where the official written notices are sent at pretty much every level. Or if you're notified by a police officer, a peace officer, Okay, so if the sheriff's office calls you up on the phone, that's considered a form of actual or written notice. In that case, you're on notice, you need to take some action. Okay, constructive notice is the notice that says, that's pretty obvious, you should have known about it. For instance, if there's a pothole sitting in right front of the driveway of the highway garage and you don't fill it, and you try to go to court and say, well, we weren't put on notice that there was a pothole there, the courts are probably going to go, well, yeah, but you should have known about it because you drove over it every day for 8 months. And there are actually court cases where every level of government that isn't protected automatically lost the lawsuit. Okay, so if it's obvious, it's long-term, yeah, you got to fix it. And by the way, if you built it, you're automatically on constructive notice. If you built it improperly, if you built this crosswalk with the ADA ramp and you built it that way, you're on notice. This one was caused by frost heaving. And the question is, when does it become constructive? Now, in terms of written protections, towns need to pass a local law to get most of the written protections. Counties have limited protection from written notice. Some things yes, some things no. And again, we don't have time to get into all the details, but if you're with the county, it's going to be limited. Villages surprisingly get complete written notice protection by state law. They get all the written notice. So the only thing I have to really worry about is constructive notice, unless, again, someone puts it in writing to them and says, you should have known about it. And then for a city, it really looks at your charter. If you work for a city or if you're an agent, helping a city out, look at the charter. It might even need to be modified or a local law passed to set up the proper written notice protection so that you're not liable for something if somebody doesn't put it in writing that you didn't know about ahead of time. Okay. Now, there's financial concerns that we have to worry about from a legal standpoint. There's things such as account funds and ledger codes and object codes. These are important to understand from a legal standpoint, but also from a financial, monetary standpoint. But putting things in the right code matters, and it can help you out. In fact, we actually noticed, we were looking through our accounts, somebody in the vet school was actually having charges on one of our accounts. How did we catch it? Well, actually someone who's in the accounting people above the local roads program actually caught it because they were noticing object codes that they were like, does this really fit? Doesn't match up. So get in the habit of looking over and making sure things are put in the proper accounts. Now, every municipality has a general fund. If you're with a town, you're going to have a DA and DB fund for highway purposes. The DA is all of the towns. There's no villages. You'll have a DA account. If you have a village, you may have a DB account. And there's rules about what gets charged for the whole town versus the part of the town that's outside the village. Again, these are things just to set them up so everybody's communicating. Counties have a machinery fund and a total D account. You may have capital projects. In fact, if you don't have a capital projects fund, we actually recommend you put one in. It's really a good way to do your bigger projects because the nice thing about these non-A account funds, once the money's in them, it's really hard to take them and put them somewhere else. Okay. In fact, most of the time it's not legal to do so. So if you have a capital project to replace the jail or to put in a really big bridge, or even there's ways to do some machinery long-term funds, you can keep the monies there. And so they won't be robbed by Peter to pay Paul. So keep that in mind. Now, in terms of our purchasing policy, again, I'm going to lower everybody's hands. How many of you have a purchasing policy? Raise your hand if you have a purchasing policy. Everyone should have a purchasing policy. We may not agree with that purchasing policy, but you should have a purchasing policy, okay? And even if you're working in the private sector, you probably have a purchasing policy, okay? When can you do X, Y, and Z? So for instance, when can you go out and get a direct purchase of things, okay? So if you just want to go down and buy some Reese's Pieces, peanut butter cups for your friends the squirrels, what amount can you spend for direct purchases? And of course, what paperwork you need. When do you have to go get what we call oral quotes, okay? Usually that's a lower amount. It's more than direct purchase, but it's not where you need written quotes. There'll be a written quotes, and then eventually you'll have to go out to bid, and there are exceptions, and we'll come back to those in a second. But in terms of having a policy, again, you want to write a reasonable policy. Most agencies that we talk to around the state require a written quote, which isn't the full contract side, but a written quote anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000. I've seen as high as $10,000 for requiring written quotes. Below that, you just have to get oral quotes. Oral quotes are a weird thing. You can do them over the phone, but you still need to document them. You still need to write them down so that later on you said, hey, we talked to JXQ Supply Company and got a price for a culvert pipe, and we talked to another one and got a price, and we chose the cheapest of the three for whatever reason, okay? But remember, these purchases are for the entire year. So if you're buying a bunch of culvert pipe and it's going to be over the bid limits, you probably need to be thinking about going out for a bid. And again, there'll be some exceptions. Now, in terms of bids, there's competitive bidding. And in New York State, the municipal rules under General Municipal Law 103, public works contracts over 35,000 and purchases over 20,000 have to have a competitive bidding process. Okay? Now, are there exceptions? Well, of course there's exceptions. We love to have exceptions. Okay? In fact, we'll come back to and let you think about those exceptions in a little bit, okay? But there are exceptions, but you have to go out for competitive bidding for purchasing things. You're buying a truck, it's over 20,000, got to go out to bid. If you're doing a chip seal, it's over 35,000, you're going to have to go out. Now, that's for the contract portion. If you're doing things in-house, you're probably okay. But again, you need to document how you're doing things, okay? Now, in a 1-hour session, we can only cover so much, but let's put all of this together and start thinking about it a little bit, okay? Now, again, I'm going to go back to this concept of everything coming up from the basis of even the law and the Constitution, but where does this all fit? And again, one of the things to think about is, do you have standards and policies, okay? This is a set of guidelines for geometric design for low volume roads up to 2,000 vehicles, which per day, that's most local roads in New York State, certainly even a lot of county highways. But let me just ask, do you have written standards for your roads and streets? Do you have a set of written standards? Yes, no, you use the state standards, you're not sure, none of the above. I've got a D over in the Q&A, so that's a not sure. Again, remember, if you can't access it, I'm fine with the Q&A. You have a yes, we have an A, we have a C. Okay. I'm glad to see that nobody is saying none of the above. Well, we got a none of the above. If you got none of the above, tell me what that means, because I'm always curious when people go none of the above. I leave it in there, but I'm not sure. If you don't have a policy, the risk is if something happens, you may be held to somebody else's policy. The thing I like about those AASHTO standards is they're good for roads up to 2,000 vehicles. It's only for geometry. It's only the curves and sight distance and things like that. So you may need to have a more local policy for thickness and drainage and stuff like that. But if you don't want to be held to somebody else's standards, you may need to develop your own policy. Okay, and we have other sessions we talk about what makes a good policy. We have a set of standards on our website, and we'll have that at the very end of the presentation. You're certainly more than welcome, and it's linked in the handout. You are more than welcome to start with those. Don't finish with it. There's, you may not have everything in there, but keep them simple. They don't need to be complicated and large. If you're okay with using state standards, we work for the state, you're doing a federal aid job and you have to follow state standards, great. If you prefer your own, that's okay too, but you really want a set of standards available to you, okay? And again, if you're doing consulting work, you're working for somebody else, know what policies they're using. You don't want to set a standard they're not following. So for instance, if you've got a municipality that doesn't have any spiral curves, for those of you who know what a spiral curve is, and you design a spiral curve, you actually have sort of broken what they have for an unwritten standard, and it actually may create problems. So try to be consistent with the agencies you're working with, okay? Now, everybody, I hope that when you're out in a construction site, puts on a hard hat. Here's an example of why you put on a hard hat. Essentially, in this particular case, the tree snapped the limb when they were doing cutting. It hit the hard hat, punched a hole in the hard hat, but didn't hurt the worker. It did its job. It failed in such a way the worker walked away. Really good, okay? Meanwhile, I got this sent to me by a former colleague, okay? This is a rock slide out in the western US. And those are three engineers who obviously don't really need to protect their brains very hard because they're not wearing hard hats. And the argument you might hear is, oh, yeah, but if a big rock comes down, a hard hat's not going to do any good. True. But that's not what the hard hat's for. They were still coming down all the time they were out there, little pebbles. They were only maybe about an inch, 2 centimeters, for those who prefer metric, in diameter. If they had hit them in the head, those people would have gotten a concussion possibly, or even worse. So no, you want to be safe. Okay, so let me ask you this. Who sets the hard hat policy? You can select all that apply, by the way. You can put in all the choices. The choices are federal, state law, PESH, contracts, the elected board, the highway or DPW official, or the crew leader. Okay, let's see what y'all think. Somebody says A. Again, you can select multiple ones. And I notice everybody's selecting a lot of choices, and that's good. And that's actually the idea behind this. When you set policies, you can set a policy, a crew leader can set a policy. Yeah, all of the above, I agree. Now, if the highway or public works official sets a more stringent policy, that would control. If the board sets a more stringent policy, that would control. If there's a contract in place that has a more stringent policy, that would control. If there's a state law, that would control. If there's a federal law or policy, that would control. Again, think about that pyramid. As you go up the pyramid, you have more control. As you come back down, that's the more restrictive thing that's going to control. Okay? So if there's a federal requirement that you have PPE on when you're in a work zone because it's in federal rules, even if you don't have a local policy, you got to follow it. You can always have a more restrictive policy at the local level, not less restrictive. Okay? So if the federal policy says that you only have to wear a hard hat in a certain situation, but you want to be more stringent, you're welcome to do that. A good example of the kind of policies that change is federal law requires you get bills paid to subcontractors in 30 days, or the contractor, excuse me, in 30 days. New York State says 7. Okay, so again, a local agency could even be more stringent than that. Same with personnel policies and purchasing policies as well. So can a local board pass a law that supersedes a state or federal law? Yes or no? Yes in every case due to home rule? No. Yes if more restrictive? Yes with some caveats. I got a C. So it's not in every single case due to home rule. There's a lot of power with home rule, but remember, has to be more restrictive. You can't say, hey, the feds want us to wear hard hat. We don't want to. We're not going to. Okay. So general, yes, if more restrictive. I would be okay if you said yes with caveats because there are some times when it's the question of what's more restrictive. There have been debates about that particular issue. Okay. But generally B is the most likely answer, but I'll live with the C's. But they can supersede because they're not really superseding. They're just making it more restrictive in that case. So if we go back to our friend, the purchasing policy, again, the law says 35,000 for a public works contract. A local agency can't just say, well, our rule says 50,000. No, the 35 is fixed. That's by state law. You can't supersede that. But in terms of quotes, you can change that at a local level. Okay. And again, I said there were exceptions. So I'm going to let you now tell me some exceptions to competitive bidding. Give me some examples of exceptions to competitive bidding. Emergencies? Yep. Yeah. Specialized work, possibly. Yeah, where you can sole source it out, and both in the Q&A and in the thing I saw. Yep, piggybacking. And piggybacking is actually a generation, or if you're sharing a contract by somebody else, you're actually not breaking the exemptions. Someone else has done the contract. You're just allowed to use their bid or their contract. So piggybacking is really a good way to do it. OGS is a form of piggybacking where you're using the general services from the state. Sole source, there are requirements in defining a sole source. So make sure you understand that. Design build if authorized, i.e. if you work for the state, locals are not allowed to do design build yet, okay? If it's less than a fixed amount, again, those fixed amounts, but if you're above those amounts, you have to have one of these exemptions. Surplus and secondhand equipment, you can purchase it. Now, if you want to go to an auction and buy something, you can do that, but you actually have authorization from the board beforehand to purchase something, okay? So you still need to have that. And there are certain rules for contracting that are allowed in New York and some that are not. So make sure you understand which ones are allowed and which ones are not. So for instance, design build is one that's not. Leases, again, there's procedures, but you can go with leases, professional services, hiring it. Yep, somebody beat me to the punch as I was going through my list. Okay. Real property purchases and leases as well fall outside. And again, there's rules for all of these things depending on what you're going to deal with. If you're interested, you can go look them up. Again, we have some good stuff in our powers and duties, and it will eventually rights and responsibilities. Something to think about. Now, shared services is a way also that we wind up sometimes exceeding things, but also shared services is a really important tool we need to really take advantage of because we need to work together. So give me some examples quickly of some shared services. Give me some examples of some shared services. Yeah, plowing might be one where you have somebody else do the plowing for you. You may need to do that with a contract. Okay. Okay. I can tell it's winter because the answer is plowing. If we do this in the summer, people are going to say things like sharing equipment for chip sealing. It's always fun to see those kind of things. Landscaping, possibly. Maybe you have a specialized piece of equipment. Yeah, that's a good example of something. Yeah. Possibly striping. Okay. Sharing equipment. Okay. Yeah. Good. Good answers. Okay. We got a few more here. We'll get through here to finish off our hour. Okay. I'm going to clear. I don't know why those didn't get cleared. I cleared them yesterday. So where's the edge of the right of way? Let's have you tell me where the right of way is here. We did this, talked about this before. Yeah, this is a fun one because is that pole defining the edge of the right of way or is it the fence line back there? Because the utility may have a right to be inside the right of way. Yeah, it depends. Okay. So yeah, this is a street by prescription in a village, by the way, if you're wondering. There's a sidewalk there. So yeah, it's an interesting question of where the right of way is. So it's at least outside the pavement because of the sidewalk and you're in a village, it's probably the backside of the sidewalk, but that utility pole could create some issues. So that's something you got to think about. And again, if you have something in the right of way from a utility company, they have a right to be there, but they are there at your pleasure. You can set rules for where they put the poles, even though they have a right to be inside the right of way. You can have standards for sight distance around the corner. Okay. So what are your options in this case for dealing with that? What are your options? And I'll go back to the picture while you type your answers in. What would you do there? I mean, if you're wondering, by the way, it's only about 2 seconds before you can see the car. So what do you think could be? You can clear the brush. Yeah. Yeah, you got to clear it. You have a legal right to do so? Yeah, actually you do. You may need a permit, however, you certainly want to talk to the homeowner, and the local board may want to pass a local law that says, hey, within corner properties, you've got to have a certain sight distance, okay? So yeah, you may have to go to a three-way stop short term. So think about what you can do on things like sight distances and safety and, dangerous mailboxes, okay? So, do you have a policy in place for things like that? These are all things you have to think about, okay? So now, because of our time frame, one of the things that New York State law allows is that highway agencies get to do other assigned duties. Hopefully not blowing up a whale like they did in Oregon. Search for it. You'll have a fun laugh. But what other things do you get to do that are assigned to the highway department that suddenly the highway department's an expert on? Give me some examples of that, and then we'll finish up our hour together. Give me some examples of other assigned duties. Yeah, putting in some speed humps, possibly picking up the garbage, dealing with parks and cemeteries, lighting. Yeah. And the reason that I bring this one up is at the end of this, as we think about it, We talked about finances. You have the rights, you have the responsibilities, you have the powers, you have the duties, but you also have this financial thing. So you can do all of these other activities, but the highway department may need to get reimbursed. If you're working, for instance, mowing in front of the town hall, that's a general fund charge. And even though the highway department can do it, it really should come out of the general fund. The cost of doing that should come out of the general fund. If you're doing sewer work, that's not a highway function. So there should be a separate account for the sewerage work, or it's got to be a general fund charge. And that happens a lot in villages. So the idea is we keep things where they belong. And we also understand who's got the right and responsibility. If it's too much, you got to first go back to your overall idea of safety. Okay. So just want to keep that in mind. We have our foundational webinar still coming up. I've got a question here sitting in the Q&A. Let me answer that, and we'll finish our talk together. It says, does road by use law apply in cities, particularly for sidewalks that are deeded on private property but have been installed and maintained by the city for a long time? That would fall under street pride prescription for villages as a village law. Within a city, it would actually be the charter that would control. So you need to go look at the city charter. But if it was installed and maintained by the city, you probably are under notice. So you probably have to maintain it by the fact that you've put it in. Once you build something, you have the rights and responsibilities to maintain it. But again, check back with the charter. There are some city charters that allow the city to say, we built it, but it's now the homeowners. So you're going to have to go back to your charter and check with the municipal attorney. Okay, so we have more foundational webinars. The ones with asterisks coming up, we'll have PDHs. And if you're wondering about the PDH credit, when we're done, we review everything and we will be emailing that to you. But remember, only the person who's registered gets to get it. After we do our webinars this spring, we will be going out with workshops. Rights and responsibilities will be on the road, brand new. We have a preview session coming up in February, and we'll be rolling it out in March and April, and again, out more in the fall. Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I stole a minute from you, and I'll be nice to you and let you go. Any questions? No, looks like we're good. So I want to thank Amanda and Jody in the background, and everybody, we'll see you next week on our foundational webinars. Bye-bye.